In case you think this looks a little different, it is. We are in Marion, Ohio today. 100 years ago, at this moment, presidential campaign was going on between Marion native Warren G. Harding, who owned the Marion Star, and James Cox from Dayton, who owned the Dayton Daily News. And it was an all Ohio show. So I'm going to have Fran talk a little bit about Mrs. Harding.
Well, it's kind of fun to be here today in their home. You know, Warren Harding and Florence Harding built this house the year that they were married in 1891. You know, Florence was pretty much a modern woman. She worked with her husband at the Marion Star. He was the owner, publisher, and she worked with him. And she was also helped her husband on campaigns. And she liked to campaign and share recipes. The favorite recipe I think that many people associate with Mrs. Harding was one of Warren Harding's favorite recipes, and that was his recipe for waffles. He had this saying, that was his favorite recipe, but he had this saying: you eat the first 14 waffles without syrup, but with lots of butter. Then you put syrup on the next 9, and the last half dozen you eat swimming with butter. Eaten that way, waffles never hurt anybody. So I think that's kind of a fun thing. And when the school kids go through this old home, they love reading that quote from Warren Harding. The waffle iron still sits on the gas stove, and it's just kind of a cool thing. I have to say, I've made this recipe for Mike a couple of times just to try it out. And the secret to the lightness of it is that she beat the egg whites separately and then folded them in. So, and many times she served it as a main dish, you know, not just with syrup, but with a dried beef gravy over waffles, which was really one of his favorites. Mrs. Harding was also very active in the suffrage movement. And she was, you know, I have my suffrage pin on today, and she was the very first lady to vote for her husband for president.
Talking about the waffles makes me hungry. So, Ohio has 13 presidential sites, including the Harding Center. So you can visit ohiohistory.org and look for Presidential Trail, and you'll be able to see all of those locations. Something that Fran and I have done with our kids, and it's a lot of fun. Maybe to kind of set the stage, 1920, again, 2 Ohioans running. World War I was over. The country has just gotten through what was then called the Spanish flu. The League of Nations was still a hot issue and would turn out again to be a hot issue during that presidential campaign. Some of the people who had dominated the political scene were gone or leaving. Former President Theodore Roosevelt died in 1919, actually at a young age. Woodrow Wilson was still president, but he had suffered a stroke, and he was pretty much in seclusion at the White House. As Fran said, the election of 1920 was right after women were granted the right to vote. And as Fran said, it was the first time a spouse had been able to vote for the other spouse for president. We're going to hear in a moment a little bit about the campaign. Fran and I decided to do it out here on the porch because this is where Harding campaigned. Some days he was gone out campaigning, but many days he was right here, and people chartered trains and other things to bring people in. And there's some pictures that we'll show you in a minute with this whole area out here really filled up with what looks like at least thousands and thousands of people. To give you an idea, 100 years ago, October 8th, 1920, On this date, Harding was not actually here. He was away from his front porch campaign giving speeches in St. Joseph, Missouri. And then he would go on tonight to Kansas City. Then he was headed from there to the Southwest by rail. James Cox, the Democrat candidate, was in Bloomington, Indiana today for his third barnstorming trip into that state. And for baseball fans, in those days when the World Series was played in the first week in October, the Cleveland Indians were battling the Brooklyn Dodgers in the World Series. This was Game 5, and it was starting right now at 2 o'clock. Let me now turn to Sherry Hall, who is the site manager for the Harding Home and Presidential Center. Sherry is the author of Warren G. Harding and the Marion Daily Star, How Newspapering Shaped a President. Sherry, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Governor. I'm actually in the house right behind you. I'm in one of the upstairs rooms there, and I'm in a room that Florence Harding used during the campaign as kind of a home office. And she was very instrumental in that very busy campaign, giving lots of interviews, of course, talking to particularly women voters who are going to be casting a ballot for the very first time that year. To give you a little sense about the campaign and what it was like, it's totally opposite of what we do today. When the candidate goes out and gives speeches everywhere, most of the time Harding is going to stay here, and he'll entertain thousands of people at one time who are going to come mostly by train, but some also venture over Ohio's rather suspect roads and drive here to Marion. They're going to gather before that front porch that the governor's standing on, and 5,000 to 10,000 people at a time, twice a week. Over the course of the 3-month campaign, that's all it was, 3 months, more than 600,000 people came to Marion, Ohio to listen to him and give a speech from that very porch.
That had to be good for business too, I imagine. Restaurants probably like that.
Yes, Marion's economy did really well that summer and fall.
Well, that really is great. Now, some of the time, we looked this up, and apparently today he was not campaigning here. So some of the time he must have left here and gone out and campaigned. Is that right?
He did. And a lot of folks don't know that. He did go off the front porch kind of intermittently during the campaign to visit other states. He would go by rail in 3 or 4 day trips and then come back to the porch. He would increase that a little bit through October. He ended up visiting 13 other states. Mostly he's in charge of the Midwest and the Southwest. And his running mate, Calvin Coolidge, is going to take care of speaking engagements in the Northeast. He's not going to even venture into the South because that's Democratic territory, and none of them are going to be swing states for the Republicans that year.
The solid South for the Democrats.
Absolutely.
For many, many, many years. Tell us a little bit about the house. When was it built? Who built it?
Well, the Hardings were the first and only owners of the house until it came into the hands of a private group called the Harding Memorial Association in 1925 after Mrs. Harding died. The Hardings had the house built in 1891. And during the year he and Florence were engaged to be married, and they were married actually right inside the front door there by the stairs. They lived there for the next 30 years. So it's very much not a presidential house. It's a newspaper owner's house, a small businessman's house. It's not one of the fanciest houses in Marion. It's a pretty ordinary house, which gives us a great insight into how just ordinary folks lived at that time in history.
So you're going through restoration now, and you've just built a visitor center here. How was that funded?
Well, we've done a lot here the past 2 or 3 years. We have done a complete restoration of the Harding home, so it will look as much as possible as how it looked during the 1920 campaign. That includes the grounds as well. At the same time, we have constructed a new building, the Warren G. Harding Presidential Library and Museum. which is adjacent to the Harding home. A wonderful partnership went into the building of this, the new building and the restoration. It's about half and half state capital funds, and the rest was private donations. So we really depended upon both of those avenues of revenues in completing this project.
So Fran and I had the chance just a moment ago, literally, to look at the visitor center. We looked into a couple rooms, really, really well done. When will people be able to see this?
We are working toward opening. What we've done here is basically we're opening a brand new historic site. It's much different than what we've been operating for the past 50 years or so, which is just a house museum. So in addition to trying to open up a new site, we've had COVID to deal with, as everyone else has. So we are working our way toward opening. Can't tell you an opening day yet, but as soon as we know that, we'll let people know.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you for what you've done. You've been here a few years, I know. You told me how many years?
I've been here 20. Thanks for bringing that up.
Well, you're a veteran. You're a veteran.
I'm a veteran. Maybe I should have just said that. Yes.
But but going back to when I was in the United States Congress and Marion was in my congressional district, I've always been really impressed by the dedication and the pride that people in Marion have in this home, in this history, and in Warren G. Harding. So it's a really, when you talk about a public-private partnership, it's really a great thing to see. And thank you for all that you have done.
You're very welcome.
We look forward to the time when this can open up and everybody can come see it.
We look forward to that too. Thank you, Governor. We
appreciate it. Thank you very much. Let me now turn to Dayton. I bring in Mary Kay Mabe, who is a professor at Sinclair Community College. She teaches Ohio history and teaches about James Cox. Mary Kay, thank you very much for being on.
Thank you for inviting me, Governor.
Well, tell us a little bit. The person who loses in a presidential race, doesn't have the prominence later on. But tell us a little bit about James Cox, founder of what is now Cox Enterprises, all the Cox newspapers for many, many years. And tell us a little bit about that, and then maybe about the campaign from the point of view of James Cox. And before we do that, he had an interesting running mate. I don't know if you brought the picture. You bring the picture with you?
Oh, yeah.
You have it there? We'll
If
see.
I can show it to you here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Running mate, of course, is a young Franklin Roosevelt. And this picture, I believe, was taken in Dayton.
Right.
And this was during the time when he was officially notified. Of course, he knew he'd got the nomination, but
right.
So tell us a little bit about that day, and about Cox.
Okay. He was born in a really small community right outside of Middletown called Jacksonburg. And it's a real small town. I believe last time I looked at its population was 2,000, and it was a population of 27 people, but the homestead's still there. And he completed his high school education, and he actually taught for a while. And on weekends, then he would work for his brother-in-law at a Middletown newspaper, and he grew to enjoy being a journalist, more so than being a teacher. And so he had an opportunity one time to cover a story, and at that time, I believe it was a train wreck. And so in order to hold on to the telegraph lines, he had the telegraph operator start transmitting the Bible until he could come back and recapture the lines and actually file a story.
That's one way to beat the competition, right?
Yes,
You
yes,
hang
yeah.
on to the line. So he ends up with the Dayton paper.
Right, right. But before he ended up with the Dayton paper, he was actually a special assistant to a congressman to Washington, D.C., gentleman by the name of Paul Sorg. And he made some very interesting acquaintances when he was in Washington, D.C., but he told Paul Sorg that he always wanted to have his own newspaper. So Paul Sorg helped him finance the purchase of the Dayton Evening News. And he purchased the newspaper, and once he purchased it, he found out the subscribership wasn't quite what was reported, but he made a success of it. And as time went on, then he started to use his newspaper to kind of combat some local social issues. And he caught the attention of the local Democratic Party, and the local Democratic Party in Dayton then asked him to be a candidate for at that time, it was the 3rd Ohio Congressional District. It's the district that Mike Turner has today. And
it actually remained the 3rd district for a long time after that as well. So ends up 1920, he's governor of Ohio.
Right.
And tell us a little bit about that picture that we saw, what was going on that day. That was a big celebration in Dayton as the campaign was really rolling.
That's the day that he was notified officially of his nomination of being the Democratic candidate. He knew from back in July, but this was in August when Franklin Roosevelt came to town, and they started, if anybody's familiar with Dayton, they started down by the river on Monument Street and Main Street, and they walked the distance between that location down to the fairgrounds. And the event was supposed to start at 2 o'clock, but by the time they got there, it was 4 o'clock because they stopped and said hi to everyone. And he had a speech all prepared. It was about 8,000 words long. And by the time he was able to give his speech, the weather started to change, and he had to cut it short because the storm clouds were moving in. But that was the day that he officially began his campaign, and that was August of that year.
And he would campaign mostly on pretty big, significant trips, right?
Yeah, he would. He and Franklin Roosevelt would pick a coast. One started on the East Coast, one started on the West Coast, and they just kind of crossed back and forth. Their goal was to hit every state they possibly could. And Wright State has a really interesting map in their special collections and archive that shows all the different locations that they visited along that campaign.
Well, that's great. I'll go back to that picture because, you know, it to me is a very significant picture because Franklin Roosevelt, not much over a year, I believe, after that, got polio, and of course, never walked really on his own completely again. And so here you see this youthful, tall, good-looking guy, and you know, then a lot was ahead of him in the future, of course, and four-term president, but also, you know, that next year got polio and had to fight his way back from that. So, well, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Really appreciate that. And
thank you,
both of you coming in. Thank you, so very, very much. Let's go, Eric, if we can, to look at the results of that election. And we'll look at both Ohio and we'll look at the U.S. You can pull those maps up. Presidential election, as you basically can see, pretty much the solid South went for the Democrat, James Cox, and then Harding looks like carried pretty much everything else. Let's take a look at Ohio. Again, the red is Harding, blue is Cox, and pretty much it looks like a landslide in Ohio as well. Before we come back to the present, it's a book, Journey Through My Years by James Cox, written in 1946, I believe. And I was looking through it yesterday and came across this part. This is Cox describing what happened after he got the nomination. After Cox got the nomination, Senator Harding gave a public statement saying, and I quote, Governor Cox's nomination is an added consideration shown to our great state of Ohio, for which I'm glad, and gives reasonable assurance that finally a newspaper man is to be made the nation's chief executive. Ohio has accorded to Governor Cox very unusual distinction, and he deserved his notable victory at San Francisco, where the convention was. His nomination will not in any way change our activities in Ohio. It is a great party contest before us, to be fought on great principles involved, and neither place of residence nor personality will have any marked influence on the result. So that was the comment from Senator Harding. And in the book, Cox goes on right after that to say, this was characteristic of Warren G. Harding. He was a warm-hearted man with most gracious impulses. He was not one to harbor grievances or deliberately do injury to any man. He had advanced from state senator to lieutenant governor and then to the United States Senate. To him, that was the ideal public assignment. Now, many unkind things have been said and written of Mr. Harding. Harsh criticism is the penalty laid upon most public men. The scandals of his administration inspired many an accusing word against his character. That he was amiable to the point of weakness, that he lacked vigilance, and that he permitted himself unfit associates cannot be denied. But he was an honest man. And while the conduct of many close to him was reprehensible, his own official record was never tarnished with dishonor. So I just found that interesting. 100 years ago, back to today,